Oklahoma was once the home of American Indians, forced westward by the federal government in the 1830s. When the Oklahoma Territory was opened for settlement in 1899, it offered African Americans a chance for a new beginning in a state without history of slavery or segregation. From the 1890s through the early 1900s, thousands of African Americans and whites moved to Oklahoma and took advantage of vast amounts of undeveloped land. Many whites brought their prejudices with them and established Jim Crow laws that separated the races. Despite these laws, there was still greater opportunity for African Americans than in the Deep South. Ralph Ellison's parents were among the many that moved to this region from Tennessee to escape poverty. They settled in Oklahoma City, where Ellison was born on March 1st, 1914. During this era, many films, such as the 1915 spectacle Birth of a Nation, branded African Americans as subhuman.
The physical hardships and indignities of slavery were benign compared with this continuing debasement of our image. In the struggle against Negro freedom, motion pictures have been one of the strongest instruments for justifying some white Americans' anti-Negro attitudes and practices.
His mother worked as a domestic worker in homes of affluent whites and often carried home magazines for Ellison. This reading broadened his perspective and motivated him to consider going beyond his limited environment. This also caused Ellison to believe achievement could lift him out of his meager conditions. His father enjoyed reading, and one of his favorite writers was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He named his son after Emerson because he wanted him to be a writer. Lewis Ellison didn't live to see this. In 1917, he was killed on a construction site where he was a supervisor. His wife Ida had to raise their two young sons alone. Ellison knew about his father's great interest in Emerson, and that he had been named after the writer. Later, after Ellison grew older, he read Emerson's work titled Self-Reliance, which expressed the philosophy that the individual was responsible for his destiny, and he adopted this belief. After Ellison's mother managed to save enough money to buy him a used cornet, he took a serious interest in music. During his youth, he trained daily to reach his goal of being a jazz musician by playing in his local high school band and studying music by legends Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. His dedication was rewarded with a music scholarship to Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where he studied from 1933 to 1936. At college, his part-time job in the library also opened avenues to study. When he was 20 years old, he read a poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland and was inspired to start writing poetry. For the first time, Ellison considered being a writer.
The wasteland seized my mind. I was intrigued by its power to move me while eluding my understanding. Somehow its rhythms were often closer to those of jazz than were those of the Negro poets. And even though I could not understand them, its range of illusion was as mixed and varied as that of Louis Armstrong, and thus began my conscious education in literature.
This helped him to understand that he could translate the same message in literature that he was able to do through music. Ellison's obsession about his existence drove him. He read many books by writers such as Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, and Ezra Pound.
His study of music gave him the discipline, the organization to focus, but he loved writing. He enjoyed it just as he did music.
At the end of his junior year in 1936, he traveled to Harlem, New York, with a plan to stay for the summer to work and save enough money to return to school in the fall.
Black life in Harlem during that period, it was the Depression. Blacks, it was not the Harlem of 1914 to 1917, where blacks rushed to New York because they knew that there were going to be jobs there. It was the Great Migration, the 1920s, the Renaissance, the time of rebirth of African American culture. In 1936, it basically was a place where blacks were attempting to survive, to maintain even some of the gains that they had made during the Harlem Renaissance. Ellison was there. He had to do odd jobs.
He wasn't able to find anything better than part-time jobs that paid poorly. And when the summer ended, he hadn't made enough money he needed. He decided to stay in Harlem.
Through the very process of slavery came the building of the United States. Our Negro situation is changing rapidly, but so much which we've gleaned through the harsh discipline of Negro American life is simply too precious to be lost. I speak of the faith, the patience, the humor. These are some of the things through which we've confronted the obstacles in which we fail not adapt to changed conditions, lest we destroy ourselves. Times change, but these possessions must endure forever, not simply because they define us as a group, but because they represent a further instance of man's triumph over chaos.
On the steps of the YMCA, Ellison met writers Langston Hughes and Alain Locke. Soon after, when Hughes found out about Ellison's fascination with literature, he arranged for him to meet novelist Richard Wright in 1936. Impressed by Ellison's wide knowledge about many subjects, Wright assigned him to write a book review for the magazine he was editing. Soon after, Wright encouraged Ellison to try writing fiction, and he began his first attempt at short stories. By 1938, Wright's national success enabled him to gain influence, which he used to help Ellison and other African Americans to get jobs with the Federal Writers Project.
There was still that ability to go to Harlem and to achieve that kind of pursue those intellectual goals. As far as economic survival, it was not very good for African Americans politically, and the only thing I think that blacks could hold on to without just sinking into hopelessness was the cultural aspect. That was one thing. They still could become creative. They still could get some of their works published.
Ellison left 4 years later after being hired as managing editor of the Negro Quarterly magazine. He stayed until 1943, then joined the Merchant Marines. After being honorably discharged in 1944, he won a $1,500 fellowship to write a novel, published the same year. The next year, he started work on Invisible Man, a novel about a young man's struggle to assert his identity.